Welcome to the podcast called The Battle for African Agriculture, the space where we challenge dominant narratives and imagine just sustainable futures, especially when it comes to food and farming in Africa. Today's conversation cuts right to the heart of the critical question: how can we truly feed ourselves in a system not built for us? Our guest is Professor William G. Mosley, a leading voice in the global food justice movement and author of the new book, Decolonizing African Agriculture, Food Security, Agroecology, and the Need for Radical Transformation. William is a professor of geography at Macalester College in Minnesota and a former member of the UN high-level panel of experts on food security and nutrition. He brings over 2 decades of field experience across Africa and a fierce commitment to challenging the status quo, whether it's corporate-dominated food chains, green revolution ideologies, or development policies that ignore farmers' voices. In today's episode, we will unpack why African agriculture remains trapped in colonial patterns and how agroecology offers a real path forward and what decolonization actually means on the ground for farmers, policymakers, and all of us who care about food justice. I will start by asking you about the discussions that you had with somebody from USAID.
Yes.
What I mean, I wrote an article called "Damies of USAID," and got a little bit of traction. And by now, you know my view about USAID. You know the positive, both the positive and the limitations. But what you wrote, let me read what you wrote back to you.
Okay.
You said you met somebody, I don't remember exactly when, he's USAID representative of one of the countries. So you said, I remember asking him why in the aftermath of a major drought and famine, were the US government supporting cotton production both directly via bilateral assistance and indirectly via the World Bank?
Yes.
It was an industrial crop that could not be eaten, degraded the soil, and was causing farmers to become indebted. His response was eliminating. I mean, 3 points that I would subsequently hear repeated by Malian civil servants. I'm surprised, because I thought you'd hear this argument all over Africa. One, that Mali needed to produce cotton to meet its debt obligations. Two, that cotton production was key to poverty alleviation in a country like Mali. And three, that cotton and food crop production were complementary or symbiotic. Cotton, he argued, solved a number of problems, including boosting food production. Can you reflect on this conversation, and can you go a little bit deeper into this reasoning? Why you remembered it after so many years?
Yes. So I have a very vivid memory of this conversation. I had been a Peace Corps volunteer in Mali for about a year at this point. So this was around 1988. And I was beginning to get an understanding of the role of cotton production in the village and all the problems it was creating. And there were a bunch of agricultural volunteers that gathered for this meeting in the capital city, Bamako, and he was the director of USAID, so the top USAID official in Mali. And he explained a bit the different things that USAID was doing in the country. And then I asked him this question that you read, why is the US government supporting this? It just seems so problematic. I mean, I think the broader context for this was structural adjustment, known as neoliberal economic reform. And, the World Bank had given loans to Mali, in exchange for policy reform. And a big piece of the policy reform was for countries to focus on exports for which they were deemed to have a comparative advantage. And that's a whole nother discussion, but
Yeah.
Mali was framed at being good at producing cotton. And the idea was that, the more cotton they produced and exported, this would allow Mali to satisfy their debt obligations. And the US, has an interest in preserving the international sort of financial order, and they don't want countries defaulting on their debts. But I think also very importantly, at the time, we're beginning to see the emergence after the 1987 Brundtland Report on Sustainable Development. This very central to that report is this idea that there's a relationship between poverty and environmental stewardship. And I think it was a bit of a compromise. I think up until the Brundtland Report, there was an earlier UN Environment and Development Conference in the 70s where sort of human activity and industrial production in particular were seen as at odds with environmental stewardship. Here, they're trying to suggest that economic activity and the environmental stewardship can go hand in hand, and that there were all these ideas about poor people doing things to degrade the environment, which I question and I think were problematic. But his statement that, basically, if Mali produces more cotton, farmers are going to make more money, and then they're going to be less likely to engage in environmentally deleterious behavior. Of course, what that obfuscates is that, and this shows up in the studies I subsequently did, is that the wealthier farmers were farming more cotton, using lots of inputs. It was leading to a problem known as soil acidification and declining yield. So it was bad for maintaining the sort of health of the soils. But what the director was telling me was sort of consistent with this emerging notion that you need to alleviate poverty in order to address environmental degradation. And then the third piece, this idea of the complementarity between cash crop production and food crop production. I think the idea was that if you grew cotton, you could use some of the inputs for food production, or you could buy machinery like plows that you could use with food crop production. And studies we did showed that that was true for the wealthiest of farmers. But for the middle income and the lower income farmers, when they start growing more cotton, they're reducing their food crop production. So ultimately, they have to buy more food, and they would get in this vicious cycle of, they're running out of food at the end of the season. The food prices are going up, and now they're vulnerable to these price fluctuations. And so, of these three assertions that USAID director made, I will give him the first one. It did allow Mali to earn money and pay off its debts at the national level. But his second and third assertions, I think are inaccurate. That both conceptually and sort of what happened in practice. But for him, it was a nice, elegant argument that allowed him to justify what the US government was doing. And I think very interestingly, this gets internalized by a lot of civil servants in the country who are essentially saying the same thing.
Yeah, I think we'll come back to it later on, but kind of similar experience, the push by Agra for Burkinabe women to produce rice.
Yes.
The idea is that if they produce rice, then they can sell the rice and they can fulfill the nutrition of their their household.
Mm-hmm.
But you've elegantly compared the people who've planted rice and others who didn't,
Mm-hmm.
and you could find, no better life for people who are growing rice for
Mm-hmm.
woodmen, and even they're much more nutritionally deficient,
Mm-hmm.
But
Mm-hmm.
we'll talk about that later, because it's not
Yes.
only for cash crops,
Yes.
like cotton or something, but even
Mm-hmm.
for crops which are supposed to address their nutritional insecurity. This doesn't hold true.
Yes.
Okay, and also, at the beginning of your book, you said two things that spoke to me.
Mm-hmm.
Well, I mean, as a social scientist myself, to some extent,
Yes.
I also had to declare where I come from when I do this research.
Mm-hmm.
But in your declaration, you said two things.
Mm-hmm.
One is that you said you come from another culture. You are a white man
Mm-hmm.
going into local communities in Africa.
Mm-hmm.
Obviously, you come with certain notions
Mm-hmm.
of what Africa and Africa is.
Mm-hmm.
So you have a lens already, that you observe what you observe.
Mm-hmm.
It's very difficult for you to really understand the community, even though, as you said, it can give you like an outsider perspective
Mm-hmm.
of what the community is. But to really, really understand that community will be a little bit difficult. That was one of your declarations. And the second one is also you have worked in a number of institutions,
Mm-hmm.
a number of research centers, and big development organizations and whatever. And you
Mm-hmm.
bring that one also. I mean, that I like that, because that declaration, because I have interacted with a number of experts. They come to Africa and they stay in Africa for 2 to 3 years,
Mm-hmm.
even shorter, when they
Mm-hmm.
act as an expert on Africa. They act as if they know everything about Africa.
Mm-hmm.
And they're the most difficult people. They sit in key institutions in the NGO world and the development and doing what that, but they know. Oh, Kenya, I know Kenya, the people are like this. That's what they want. I
Mm-hmm.
just want you to reflect on that, from your experience.
Yeah. So in the first chapter, I do acknowledge my own positionality, how I come at these issues from a particular angle because of my life experiences. And yes, I'm an outsider. Even though I've lived in a variety of different countries, sort of African countries, cumulatively for over 10 years, I have often done so as a privileged outsider. And that's a really different perspective than someone who's, either spent their entire life in a country or in a particular community. And I think that's important to acknowledge.
Mm,
Now, sometimes there are certain benefits to being an outsider because people will tell you things that they wouldn't necessarily tell their neighbor or someone who
mm,
lives in the
mhm,
community long term. But, I am never going to fully understand the minutia of
mm,
what is happening in a particular community.
mm,
Furthermore, yeah, I also acknowledge that I work for all these different institutions. You know, the World Bank. I was a USAID contractor.
mm,
I've done consulting work for ILRI. I worked in a variety of universities,
mm,
both in the African context and in the US. And if you read the book, you'll learn that I'm very critical of the work of a lot of these institutions.
yeah,
But I do think it's important to acknowledge that they're not monolithic,
yeah,
that there are
yeah,
good
yeah.
people working in these organizations.
Exactly. Yeah. No, I know.
And so, sometimes my students think they're all evil, and it's more nuanced than that.
Mm.
But oftentimes they're operating under certain constraints, um, which sort of contort and change what they do. Um, so yes, I just think it's really important to acknowledge these things up front before
Yeah.
you take your reader through, these different case studies that I do in the book.
Yeah, I think we'll come back to this point a little bit later on, probably,
Mhm.
while you were talking about your experience in Burundi,
Mhm.
the experience, the positive experience that you saw from Burundi extension agents,
Mhm.
when you wrote and gave that back to your
Yes.
employers, they were not happy. And you
No.
raised 3 points, 3 critical points. We'll come back to that,
Okay. Okay.
which I found quite fascinating.
Mhm.
Um, the your interaction with the Malian agricultural experts, let me read that.
Mhm.
How is that, you ask, how is that Malian agricultural researchers and extension agents,
Mhm.
largely trained in crop science or agronomy, were producing advice, no, providing advice to
Mhm.
smallholder farmers that was not good for them? The
Mhm.
answer, as I will argue in this book, is that the science of agronomy is not apolitical,
Mhm.
but rather infused with power and politics.
Mhm.
In other words, agronomists have focused on developing specific types of crops with certain characteristics for the benefit of certain entities
Mhm.
and groups of people. We cannot begin to decolonize African agriculture and address food insecurity until we understand this dynamic. I really, really want you to expand that. It's a very, very strong statement.
Yes. Yes. So, the title of the book is Decolonizing African Agriculture. And I make this distinction between political decolonization and intellectual decolonization.
Mhm.
So political decolonization is the process that unfolds after African countries get their independence, a lot of them in the 1960s. But intellectual decolonization has to do with the ideas that are central to many of our disciplines, which in many cases may date back to the colonial period.
Mhm.
And for a variety of reasons, they haven't really shifted, right? And while I think this is the case in all disciplines, including my own discipline of geography, I think certain applied fields, agronomy, public health, forestry, that
Mhm.
had a very close relationship with the colonial powers, I think it's a particular issue for them. And so what we call development agronomy today used to be known as tropical agronomy.
Mhm.
And there was a very explicit goal in the colonial period of maximizing the production of certain commodity crops that would then be exported and would fuel industrialization in the global north and in Europe.
Mhm.
And that idea in agronomy of sort of maximizing production, the sort of productionist angle, has persisted over time.
Mhm.
And the crops that we have decided to focus on and within agronomy and the way sort of maximizing production is pursued using a set of inputs and improved seeds is of benefit to certain entities.
Mhm.
The oftentimes the companies that are involved in selling those inputs. And so this idea of intellectual decolonization is to recognize this historical bias. I use this term political agronomy,
Mhm.
which is an interdisciplinary conversation I was heavily influenced by a meeting I went to in 2016 at the Institute for Development Studies. It was led by James Sundberg, who was a professor there. And there were agronomists, geographers, anthropologists, sociologists, so people, economists, and it was all centered on this sort of political agronomy conversation, and sort of realizing that agronomy is not apolitical. Most sciences try to present themselves as neutral, but political agronomy is an attempt to more explicitly acknowledge the politics that are infused in that discipline. And now getting down to the ground level, if we think about ministries of agriculture in different African countries, if we think about field agents, a lot of them have been trained in agronomy. Certainly higher level people in ministries may have been trained in the global north. And so they have internalized this thinking about, agronomy and how that should be pursued and what's important and sort of maximizing production of certain crops. And then that gets replicated in schools of agriculture in different African countries. And I think an important part of decolonizing African agriculture is actually to engage in the decolonization of the mind, to acknowledge these implicit biases that are in our training, which then influence, how we engage with the world, and in the case of ag extension agents, the way they're behaving towards African farmers.
Yeah. Thank you very much. Yeah, impressive. Let's go to Burkina Faso, rice and agra.
Yes.
So tell me about that story. It's a fascinating story.
Yes. So like many countries, a big shock happens in 2007, 2008, when there's a global food crisis. And average food prices go up 50%, but rice goes up 100%. And what we had seen in a number of West African cities leading up to this point is that as people are moving to urban areas, their diets are changing, rice is increasingly framed as sort of a modern crop and something that middle-class urban people should consume. But also, based on surveys we've done with women in urban areas, they like rice because it's pretty easy to cook. It expands when you cook it, so it fills people up. So it's appealing to them in that way. And so rice consumption has been climbing in urban areas. And the challenge for Burkina Faso is they only produce 25% of their own rice. So when the 2007, 2008 global food crisis hits, this is a particular problem, and there are food demonstrations, also known as food riots, in a number of West African cities, including in Burkina Faso and Ouagadougou and Bobo Dioulasso. So when they are approached by AGRA, the Alliance for a Green Revolution in Africa, which is funded by the Gates Foundation, the Burkina Faso government is interested because they're trying to figure out ways to increase food production. Now, interestingly, in southwestern Burkina Faso, rice is considered to be a traditional women's crop. Women, unlike other agricultural lands, which are largely controlled by men, the women control the rice lands, certainly in areas south of Bobo Dioulasso. And women would use rice was really important for sort of funerals and weddings. It was like a special crop for special occasions. But Agra wants to turn this into more of a commercial crop that's going to be sold to urban populations. And so you're kind of taking what historically might have been a food crop and turning it into more of a cash crop.
Mm.
And they did surveys with the urban population to figure out what kind of characteristics of rice they liked. And then they provided a lot of funding to seed breeders in Burkina to develop these new rice varieties. And then um, they start encouraging Burkina Burkina Bay rice farmers to grow these new varieties of rice. They also did certain types of improvements to the rice fields. Um, uh, they leveled them. They put in sort of micro dikes to control water. Um, and there's sort of a quota for women to participate in these projects. There are a lot of challenges for women farmers. One is that in areas south of Bobojalaso, the women traditionally controlled the rice lands, and now it's going to be men and women. So women are effectively losing a portion of their land. Also, you have to, rather than seeds that were sort of kept in the community and exchanged between community members, now you have to buy the seeds and buy inputs, and you're doing so on credit. And this is an extra challenge for women. And thirdly, they had made arrangements for certain merchants to sort of bring the inputs to the farmers, and then the farmers would sell that back to the merchants, who would then mill the rice, package it, and sell it in the urban areas. But there was often a delay between the time the women sold the rice and then they actually got paid. And that was a challenge because when you around the time you're harvesting rice is also when you have to pay school fees.
Mm.
This sort of September, October, November period when the schools are starting up. They may have medical bills to pay, they may have debts to settle. And so the women started doing what we call side selling. They, in
Mm.
order to get money more quickly, they would sell the rice to someone else, which the project considered to be very problematic. I would frame it more as the project didn't really understand the needs of women involved in the project. And so they were adapting and trying to make it work for them. But the end result is that the women who participate in the project are not doing any better in terms of food security and nutrition than women who are not participating in the project. So there are no net benefits despite this tremendous investment. The people who are benefiting are kind of people higher up the value chain, the seed companies, the seed scientists that were participating in these projects.
Yeah. That was one of the revealing stories. But there is also one, you even named it the political ecology of proliferating herbicides.
Yes.
Um, why do you call it political ecology of proliferating herbicide? What's political ecology to do with that? And you talked about, two herbicides, glyphosate and atrazine.
Yes.
As I speak to you today, I think that we're going to finish. We are organizing a big meeting for African journalists
Mm-hmm.
to explain to them the impact of pesticides and to help us
Yes.
really navigating that issue. So I found that, that part of your book very much interesting. So would you expand on that?
Sure. So political ecology, like political agronomy, is another interdisciplinary conversation
Mm.
involving geographers, anthropologists, sociologists, political scientists. It political ecology, the shorthand definition is the political economy of human environment interactions.
Mm.
They're thinking about human environment interactions, in this case, how the farmer is interacting with their farm field,
Mm.
but also broader scale sort of structural conditions that are impacting their behavior because they're not operating in a vacuum. And what was really surprising for us is when we were doing the surveys for the women involved in these rice projects and the women not involved in them, it came out that 92% of the women in the surveys were using herbicides at least twice per season. And this was very surprising to me because this was almost unheard of, 10, 20 years prior to this. And so I really wanted to understand how it came to be that women were more regularly resorting to herbicide use. And we have a political ecology explanation that emphasizes thinking about processes happening at different scales. And there are 3 different scales I talk about. Very broadly, glyphosate, which the trade name was Roundup, goes off patent in 2000. We see the rise of generic production in places like India and China. So now it's much cheaper than it used to be, these chemicals. They then negotiate entry into the West Africa region, where there's a regional agreement that if it's safe to enter one country, then all the other countries will open up their market.
Yeah.
So the herbicide companies would negotiate entry into the country which had the most lax rules, and then the market would be opened up for all the other countries. So now we have cheaper herbicides on the market in West Africa. At sort of the mesoscale, we have increasing numbers of young people, both men and women, who are leaving the agricultural sector to work in artisanal gold mines. And that's the sort of proliferation of artisanal gold mining. So this is small scale mining, which is separate than large scale industrial mines, is not only taking off because the global price for gold is going up, but there's a lot of new sort of machinery. Much of it comes from China that just makes it easier for people to mine gold. And so they're leaving the farming sector, they're working in the mines. And what that means is that labor is constrained in the farming sector. So that's the second scale. The final scale at the level of the farm and the farming household is that these are mostly male-headed households, male-dominated households. And there's a gender dimension to this. Women who farm don't have as much control over household labor. Weeding is a very labor-intensive process. There's less labor in general because of artisanal gold mining. And now these herbicides, which are cheaper, kind of solve a labor problem, right? And so they're increasingly using glyphosate and atrazine. The problem is the unknown health consequences, right? So glyphosate is a suspected carcinogen. Atrazine is a known hormone disruptor. And the women are kind of aware that there might be a problem. They don't want to, use the herbicides when their young children and babies are around. There's kind of some sense of this, but there's very little official information on the potential health consequences. So that was our sort of political ecology explanation for why there's been this big upsurge in herbicide use.
We're about finalizing on 2 more questions. This a Burundi experience, huh?
Yes.
And out of that experience, you have 3, what do you call it, explanations, You'll tell me what the Burundi experience is, and the 3 kind of explanations that you have for that. The first one, especially, first, dominant narratives in the status quo approach get perpetuated over time by seemingly small acts of confirmation and reinforcement, So you talk about development consultants, so you just don't want to ruffle the feather. Mostly they would write and give and maybe present in the workshops what they would think would guarantee them another consultancy. I I hear a lot of impact on how agriculture is practiced, how policies are designed in Africa because of this one reason.
Mhm.
Would you agree with me? And but can you elaborate, the story of Burundi and
Sure.
yeah.
Yeah, so in 2016, I was hired as a consultant to do a political economy study of a crop livestock project in Burundi. And Burundi, um, at the time, had a sort of a pariah political leader. It was geopolitically isolated, and there were increasingly few NGOs operating in the country. But this project was it was jointly run by ILRI, which is the International Livestock Research Institute, and IITA, which is the International Institute for Tropical Agriculture. And it was a crop livestock um, integration project. And traditionally, these projects will introduce sort of improved breeds of livestock and sort of modern animal husbandry methods. And in this particular case, um, I really thought the local staff had come up with an alternative approach that was acknowledged the constraints which the country was facing, right? It's extremely poor country. It's one of the poorest countries in Africa, Burundi. And because it was geopolitically isolated, sort of importing and exporting things was challenging. And so they devised this approach where you would pen local breeds of animals. You would then use the manure from the animals to fertilize your crops. Um, and the crop refuge could be fed back to the animals. And they had sort of different levels for different, smaller animals for lower income households, bigger animals for higher income households. But I thought it was a really interesting approach. I wrote up my report, and I thought this was well adapted to the political economy context. And I went on to say that this could be an interesting alternative to the New Green Revolution for Africa approach. And the ILRI, the people at the ILRI headquarters did not like this. In fact, they said I was getting too political. And I made some modifications to my language, but I kind of stuck with my original assertions in my final report. What I think is interesting is that as an academic, I have a regular job, and it's not like my livelihood depends on getting another consultancy contract. And so I could push back in a way that if most independent consultants want another gig, I never got another gig with them, but they're dependent on getting another consultancy. And I think my point is that these, in this case, if we think about these international ag research institutes, they're adhering to a certain narrative and a dominant paradigm about the way things should be done. And there are these small interactions between leadership and consultants that sort of perpetuate that. And people who are consultants, are oftentimes reluctant to push back against that, even if the evidence they're finding is different than that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, this is incredible. It's an incredible story, actually. Finally, you've talked about, more environmentalists talk about think globally and act locally. But you're saying that, the problem is local action is very much conditioned by what's happening globally. You're advising that, people should be aware of the international context, even a context outside of their environment.
Mm-hmm.
I find that very much interesting because in the context of food sovereignty, we talk about, sovereignty at a very local level. One of the challenges of defining sovereignty is the locus of sovereignty. Where is it? Is it community level, district level, a bigger level, or at country level,
Mm-hmm.
Because you can't assume that the communities are there by themselves.
Mm-hmm.
Um, Government will have an agriculture policy, economy policy, soil policy, water policy, and where are they implementing it with the local community? So it's a very difficult environment to navigate for local communities.
Mm-hmm.
So, yeah, would you comment around that?
Yeah, I could take this in many different directions.
Mm,
Um, maybe I'll focus on South Africa and sort of the land reform case study that I did there. I think what's interesting about South Africa is, you know, apartheid ends. The fact that Black South Africans had lost their land during the apartheid era and earlier is a huge issue. There's this yearning for sort of justice and returning land back to the Black community. Um, I think a combination of the business community in South Africa and the World Bank and the IMF basically tell the ANC and Nelson Mandela, if you pursue radical land reform, you're going to end up looking like Zimbabwe. And kind of through scare tactics, they get this market-based land reform approach, very incremental, working within the market. So white farmers will put land up for sale, and then the government will give grants to Black farmers in order to purchase that farmland. And then we get further reform when Thabo Mbeki is president after Nelson Mandela, and they shift to a very commercially oriented agricultural approach. So if you're a Black farmer and you get grants from the government, you essentially have to have a business plan to run a commercial farm. And that's a reflection of the commercial farming lobby in South Africa that sees, large scale commercial farming as the only real type of
mm,
agriculture, and that small scale farming is sort of primitive and backward. As a consequence, a lot of these farms have failed. Much of the farmland that was sold was more marginal. That these are the land that the white farmers didn't want, and now you're expecting new emerging farmers to make a go of it. And what they foreclosed is, breaking up large farms into smaller plots and having a more food security orientation, which, I think food production at the local level, as well as having healthy food available, sort of regionally within the country, would have been much better for sort of
mm,
food and nutrition security. And so I think what you're seeing there is that the food sovereignty alternative kind of got shut down both by international organizations that shape land reform and then the commercial farming lobby in South Africa.
yeah.
And, I think we can imagine food sovereignty happening at different scales, but the politics happening at these other scales, we have to acknowledge that that's real. And I think ultimately you need social movements to sort of shift that conversation.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Thanks, and you've given me a lot of time now. It's the second round. I hope if we need third round, we'll come back to talk again, you know.
Okay.
When you book again, I might have other questions. But on behalf of the people that are going to watch this, thank you hugely. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you very much, Million. And I just want to acknowledge the really important work that AFSA is doing. I think you're
Thank you.
a real beacon in the African context. And as I write in the book, we really need civil society. We need social movements if we're going to see a shift in sort of the dominant paradigm and the way we think about agricultural change that can benefit people.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thanks a lot.